Welcome. It's good seeing you. French and I have known each other for multiple decades. You've had an interesting and varied career. You've been a banker, you've been a policymaker, you've spent time in Washington, and now you're representing the 2nd District of Arkansas. Central Arkansas?
Right.
Includes Little Rock,
surrounding metro
north of there.
Not a gerrymandered district.
Before we get into the substance, maybe just a little, I'm always interested. You know, I spend most of my time flying outside the United States. I get back to Kentucky once a year. What are the voters in Arkansas, what do they care about?
Well, first and foremost, they care about a vigorous economy with job opportunities. And we've seen the economy really perk up in the last 2 years, I think due to the regulatory environment and the tax reform environment. We've seen job participation rate tick up in Arkansas. We've seen our unemployment rate drop in Central Arkansas to the 3.7% range, for example. So the environment is good. So the economy is number one. I think they're concerned about the impact of the trade policies in this administration and the impact on agriculture. Arkansas is the largest rice producing state in the United States, the largest rice exporter. Obviously, it's with Tyson Foods headquartered there, a major protein exporter as well, the largest poultry producer. So agriculture is important. And about 360,000 jobs in our state are completely tied to Mexico and Canada. So trade is a relevant focus as well.
Well, why don't you just segue right into that? It's not where I want to start, but what's your prognostication for USMCA? Are we going to get a deal done, get it done this year?
Well, it's interesting for the two of us, since we were there at the beginning
NAFTA,
of NAFTA. I don't ever mention that to the president that I was there when it was negotiated. But you know, this is an improvement over the 1994 NAFTA agreement in many ways. It preserves the good things that are in NAFTA that we got accomplished, that has created one of the most dynamic markets in the world, the North American Free Trade area. But it updates it. We get digital trade,
right,
digital data, pharmaceutical changes. And for President Trump, he gets a higher U.S. content in the definition of North American content in both auto production and truck production, which was an objective he had. We also were able as Americans to get our friends to the north to open up their dairy market slightly, about a 3.59% participation in the dairy market, which is a big change from the original NAFTA. So on balance, I describe the USMCA as a better agreement than NAFTA on par. There's some things I don't like about it. It still has an implication of Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs in it that could be converted to a quota. I'm not a fan of that,
right,
but that's in the document. And then on the committees governing competition and market harmonization, there are no private sector representatives. It's all government officials. I think that's a mistake, and have urged Richard Neal and Kevin Brady at Ways and Means to press for that change, even if it's in a side letter.
And the speaker sounds like she wants to move the bill, but she wants to see labor issues and environmental changes. Can that be done on a side letter, or does it have to reopen the treaty?
Well, I think she wants to see that the labor issues that are embedded in the bill in the terms of minimum wage compensation in the auto sector implemented in Mexico. Mrs. Pelosi is not a free trader. She has not been supportive of trade policies even during the Obama administration. She went to the House floor during the Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, what we used to call fast track in the United States, and opposed it on the House floor and campaigned against it on the House floor. We were able to pass that with a mixture of Republican and Democratic votes for President Obama. And then she was not supportive of TPP when both the candidates, Clinton and Trump, said they would not support it. So this is what she said. She'd like to see Mexico take action on the labor provisions. She's concerned about enforcement. I don't know, though, if that's a policy point or an excuse point on delaying this. I hope that we can put together a coalition of Democrats and Republicans and approve the USMCA.
China is an important market as well. I saw the secretary yesterday. He said they're getting close. They have a few provisions they need to work out on some of the enforcement mechanisms and some disagreement about what tariffs remain in place. How do you see U.S.-China, and how important is China to the 2nd District of Arkansas?
It's not on the scale of Mexico and Canada, even close. But nonetheless, it's important to the United States in a whole range of issues, not to mention agricultural products. We'd like to see that expanded in China. But the real issue there are structural changes and non-tariff barrier changes. We went through this with our friends in the late 1980s and early 1990s on removing non-tariff barriers after we'd seen tariff rates fall. And our friends in Japan and the United States came together and worked to reduce non-tariff barriers. That's an ally. That's a national security partner. That's an economic partner of the United States. So to tackle non-tariff structural problems with state-owned enterprises and other ways the Chinese have made it very difficult to do business there, it's tougher with a strategic player on the world stage like China. But this is an opportunity for China to live up to their obligations under the WTO admission.
Let's go into banking. You are on the banking committee. You're a banker, a successful banker for many years in Arkansas. There's a lot of new faces on that committee. It looks a little different than it did a few years ago. Yep. How has the dynamic changed on that committee? We saw it front and center yesterday with many of the CEOs there for the hearing. Maybe talk a little bit about that as well. But how is that committee functioning? What's it like having a new chair, and what's the feel of the place like?
Reclaiming my time. That's obviously too much of a Washington joke for this. Yeah, I understand. The committee is 60 people. 34 Democrats, 26 Republicans on the House Financial Services Committee. So it's a big committee. The chairman is Maxine Waters of Los Angeles. She is the new chair for the Democrats. They have 16 new members on the committee, 9 of whom are in the Progressive Caucus of the House of Representatives. So free enterprise and economic growth and things of that nature are not real high on their agenda. They're into stopping things like economic growth, pipeline development, and the like. So the dynamic is interesting. I think Maxine's got a tough job on her hands. She has a seniority-based system where she has her oldest members in the House Democratic Conference as her subcommittee chairs, and she has this very aggressive, dynamic group of new members, 16 new members, that are trying to drive the agenda. So it's going to be challenging, I think, for her to move consensus legislation, but we have to do that. We need to get an Ex-Im Bank reauthorization. We need to get the terror risk insurance pool reauthorized in the next 2 years. We need to resolve the challenges we have with our federal flood program, which Mrs. Waters has been burned on before in previous Congresses. Mm-hmm. We need her to have a bipartisan consensus to get the flood program reformed, but with with bipartisan support.
So you think we can get Ex-Im reauthorization, we can get terrorist insurance reformed as well?
I'm optimistic about those two things on a bipartisan basis. We'll see as the months go on. I'd say the first 4 months of the year, to your question, have not been that productive. The chair has focused on principally Democratic member initiatives that didn't get much sunlight during the years of Jeb Hensarling's chairmanship of the committee. So we've been dealing with boosting spending for HUD, or cannabis banking oversight, or a variety of things that just individual Democratic members have proposed over the years but not gotten a hearing on.
And how do you assess the hearing yesterday? There were lots of discussions about gender, firearms, tobacco. I didn't hear a lot about actual banking, capital liquidity, leverage, financial vulnerabilities.
Well, our ranking member, the lead Republican on the committee, Patrick McHenry, described it in today's Wall Street Journal as a committee hearing in the search of a headline. And I think that was about right. The Democrats held this hearing ostensibly to look at the largest financial institutions in the United States, headquartered here, and how they're doing 10 years after the financial crisis. But instead of focusing on capital, liquidity, health, systemic issues facing global finance, they in turn turned it into a video clip opportunity for their re-election campaigns to beat up on Wall Street. There were serious discussions, though, about cyber risk. Jamie Dimon said that he felt like that continues to be one of the things that he's the most concerned about.
Indeed.
We talked also about that their liquidity and capital buffers are superior. Their management is superior to 07 and 08 as required by the post-crisis reforms. So it was a serious hearing, and I talked about how to better design financial sanctions so that the international financial community can have more certainty that they're complying with United Nations or U.S. financial sanctions, but that they're not a terrific burden, on our financial players. That's very important as we try to change the outlook in North Asia with North Korea or compel Venezuela to rejoin a more balanced group of nations.
Or Russia. I was at a dinner last night. We
Russia.
spent half our dinner talking about Russian sanctions, the plumbing into Russian sanctions, whether sovereign Russian debt would be the next on the list of potential sanctioned financial instruments. You mentioned Jamie. On his last call in his letter, talks about how much J.P. Morgan is spending on technology. I think it's 11 or 12 billion a year.
Right.
The Bank of America is about 16. Morgan Stanley's at 4 to 6. You're leading the technology task force for the Bank Committee. Technology, and I mentioned this morning, is the top topic whenever we get together with our board members, whether it's data privacy, how much they're spending on cyber resiliency. So as you take on this new task, how do you approach it? What's your philosophy? What do you see are your priorities?
Right. So I was excited in this Congress that I'll be the Republican leader on a FinTech task force. This is something I think that's overdue in the House to look at how we can reduce the cost of regulatory compliance through FinTech or RegTech, if you will, how we can improve outcomes for consumers and consumer access, particularly those that are unbanked and have lack of connection to financial services, all using technology. I think the starting place for the committee is to look at the Treasury report, the U.S. Treasury report that was released last summer in July. It gives a very good landscape in the United States of both federal, state, and regulatory issues connected with how do we spur innovation in FinTech, how do we continue to have the United States as a significant player and innovator in FinTech, both for disruptors and for incumbent players.
Right.
Because that's very, very, I think, important. In Little Rock, we have a FinTech incubation center at our venture center that Fidelity Information Systems runs one of them. They run an incubator accelerator program there that they manage. And then the Independent Community Bankers of America has selected Little Rock as our FinTech hub for innovative technologies geared towards a community bank platform, which is a whole different competitive situation to the issues faced, at J.P. Morgan.
So how do community banks, how do they afford the technology spend? How do they afford the customer experience, the apps, the back office operations? How do they compete in this sort of technology arms race?
Well, I've seen this my whole career. Back in the late 1970s, I was very involved in technological advance in Texas when I was worked for the largest bank at the time in Texas in the late 1970s, First National Bank of Dallas, now part of Bank America system. We were a wholesale bank. We had no retail customers, so we formed the first large shared ATM POS network in the state. So technology has always been important for banks to adopt. Community banks do it through partnership. I think that's why we want innovation out there that at all levels of scale. That's the kind of work FIS is doing, for example. They will find the most cutting-edge payment, lending, compliance technologies and put them into the platform to be able to share with their community bank customers as well as their biggest customers in the world that they serve. So I hear a lot of people talk about moving from disruption to partnership.
Right.
It's a heavily regulated business. It's very challenging for two folks in a garage to go fully digital in a global financial institution. But their ability to identify a niche technology and bring it into the system through partnership is...
There's been a real maturation. We could go to Silicon Valley a few times a year. And the first time I'd show up in a suit, and everyone would run. They thought I was from the Drug Enforcement Agency or the IRS. But
Yeah.
we've seen it. But they've gone from T-shirts and shorts to corporate logos on their polo shirts. They really are partners now, rather than trying to put J.P. Morgan out of business or any other firm. So that maturation is important, bringing new technology from a vendor perspective.
Right.
The other issue is the internet platform companies. We hear a lot from our member firms. Ant Financial's always discussed 600 million customers trying to go to 2 billion market cap, bigger than Goldman Sachs, largest money market fund in the world. Alipay is in 110 countries. Do you see those kinds of internet platform companies either for China-based or maybe Amazon as a particular risk to the banking sector?
Well, you see these enormous customer connectivity on various internet platforms. And if they can convert that into a financial services product, particularly a payment product, which is where I think the most likely place is, yeah, I think that's challenging. You still have this issue of we need to set standards in payments, we need to have regulatory expectations in payments, and we need to have integrity in that system. And that's why I think we should move to a faster real-time payment system, which the private sector has developed and embraced, and I hope that the Federal Reserve will, allow the private sector to perceive with what we think of as 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, real-time payment. I think that will help community banks and our biggest financial services players meet that challenge.
Right.
Because I see that's where these internet platforms are going to go first.
You mentioned the Fed. We have Vice Chair Rich Clarida coming up. Jay Powell, I worked with. We've known him for multiple decades. What kind of job do you think Jay is doing as chairman of the Fed Reserve?
Well, I've said from the very beginning that Chairman Powell would be a steady hand on the tiller of monetary policy. I think he's borne that out. He's a consensus builder on the Board of Governors and the Open Market Committee. That's the way he's worked. You and I have our experience with him when we had the pleasure of working with him with Secretary Brady back during the Bush 41 days. So I think that's right. I'm a bit surprised by recent Fed minutes suggesting that the balance sheet shrinking will end on September 30th.
Right.
So I still, my jury is out on whether that's a good decision or not, but that's what Washington, we love to second guess all the decisions made, at the Federal Reserve System.
Let's move just overseas. The last time I ran into you in London, maybe a year ago. You and I were at Bloomberg, actually. And any thoughts about Brexit or other shocks, potential shocks or risks you see globally that could potentially impact the U.S. or maybe even the 2nd District of Arkansas?
Well, certainly Brexit is a mess, and the EU is now granted till Halloween. Everybody can wear a costume. October 31st, this extension so that the Prime Minister and the Commons can find something they can agree on. I think the barriers obviously are Northern Ireland, Ireland's soft border issue in order to be compliant with the 1998 peace treaty, and about 90 years of tradition between Northern Ireland and Ireland where there hasn't been a hard border there. So this has turned out to be as challenging as people thought it would be. But for most international players in finance, London is still the center. And I think while people have hedged bets, I can remember back in in the late 80s, early 90s, getting ready for Hong Kong to return to China, that people hedged their bets about corporate relocations and things like that. But I think London is still, with the Anglo-American approach to regulation, the English language, English law, and hundreds of years of tradition, I think it will remain a major financial center. I think American players, of course, will have a toe on the continent, but still maintain substantial employment and investment in the city. So what's an American to say? The British, they've got to work it out.
Yeah, I agree. One of the top topics that we spend time on is AML and interdiction of illicit financial flows globally. The interdiction rate's about 1% globally. There are 2 billion financial transactions every day around the world, moving about 5 trillion, and that's in the formal financial system. You were a banker. How do you think, and how should we think about a different model of illicit finance interdiction We all fill out SARS, 2 million SARS in the U.S. every year. The U.K. is about 800,000. We check boxes, doesn't do a whole lot. How can we rethink about this whole paradigm shift?
Well, this is where I think fintech lends itself to regulatory compliance issue. I was in Boston last week meeting with a firm that is using AI in a sandbox environment to provide a much more market-based intelligence to sorting through and anticipating AML, BSA violations. And I think artificial intelligence is going to be a major player there, plus sharing of information. We have a fusion center on cyber between the private sector and the public sector in Pittsburgh, and that sort of fusion center work I think would be very helpful in the AML, BSA area. It would allow people to make much better decisions with fewer people and anticipate setting up the algorithms on what appears to be, a transaction about to go bad or a structuring issue in the case of money laundering. So we need sharing authorities in law, and we need the AI authorities in law. We have those bills pending before Congress. We have a fight going on right now over the definition of beneficial ownership and how to collect that information and what's the most cost-effective way to do that.
We have a close relationship with Europol and Interpol. I just spent a day at The Hague 2 weeks ago. And then I did a Nordic tour last week, some challenges in the Nordics. One of the challenges, sharing information across jurisdictions. You can't stop the flow of illicit finance unless you can share information. And the Europeans suffer from the lack of capacity to share across jurisdictions. Yet, juxtaposed to that, we have this discussion about data privacy, the right to be forgotten. How do you see the clash of those two different movements? How do we let people own and have their own privacy, their own data, at the same time we need to be able to have share information?
Well, Charlie Munger always suggests people invert questions to look at problems, from the 180 degree difference. And of course, right now we live in this password dependent, which is very unsafe and not safe from a cyber point of view or a privacy point of view, but we live in this password world. I think we have to go to where the consumers control their access to their information in all aspects of it, and that they don't willy-nilly check a box, terms and conditions box, that allows all their information to be scraped and sold around the world by the internet players or by companies. Banks live under Graham Leach Bliley. Right. We need something similar to that, I think, elsewhere. This has been a real challenge in the United States to reach consensus between, say, the retailing industry and the financial services industry on privacy and breach notification standards. And we need that, as Europe has adopted a very strict approach to privacy. It's not in keeping with how we operate here in the United States with the Bill of Rights, none of which it's not an option. They're all 10 important. And the Fourth Amendment on privacy is important. So reaching that balance is critical, because law enforcement, there is no end to what they want.
Correct.
They want personally identifiable information, or they claim they don't, but they do, and they want it in a database that they can search whenever they want to. And that's not in keeping with American legal traditions. But to go forward in fintech, we need to have consumers in control of their information, consumers giving you what information you need to do the work I've asked you to as a consumer. Mm-hmm. We need a breach notification system that's a federal one and not dependent on the states. Right. And then we need to get away, I think, from passwords and go to a consumer-driven authentication system that's more reliable.
Last question with just a few seconds left. You've been very vocal on stock buybacks in response to some of the criticism on stock buybacks. What's your perspective?
Well, I've been surprised, well, not surprised. In the 80s, we wanted to end deductibility of interest. We wanted to block people from doing a leverage buyout. We proposed transaction tax. Yesterday, we had a senator propose a capital gains tax in the United States on unrealized capital gains. So Washington is a center of one bad idea after another. Occasionally, and they come in avalanches, bad things come in threes. I mean, this is just another example of that. So we have a bipartisan group of people thinking they want to stop stock buybacks. That is a fundamental part of capital allocation. best left to boards of directors. Warren Buffett says if you can buy a share of stock for 80 cents and you don't have growth parameters in your company that's better than that, that's one of the best uses of excess corporate cash that you can have. Look, we have a spike in buybacks in the last 24 months due to America's historic tax reform. A majority of the companies that bought stock back, in other words, 2/3 of the money in 2018 of stock bought back were about 20 companies. What do those 20 companies have in common? They had the most funds trapped abroad. So as Americans, aren't we delighted that those companies brought that capital back in the United States, paid a tax on it, and have redistributed it for investment in this country? And one way they did that was they bought stock back, hopefully, at below intrinsic value. If they bought it above intrinsic value, they'll be punished by it in the market. And finally, R&D investing by American S&P 500 companies, CapEx S&P 500 companies, about 10 or 11% of sales is right where it's been for 30 years. So this was taking advantage of that. And I always remind my colleagues on the Hill, the people getting that money are not companies. They are the shareholders. They are labor pension funds, 401k plans, individual retirement accounts. Individual shareholders are reaping the benefit of that, and no company does that if they think they can deploy that capital above their cost of capital for a return on equity. So I just think it's another demonization issue of people who don't understand corporate finance, and they don't understand the benefits that are inuring to American shareholders and business. So thanks for letting me get on my soapbox.
We're out of time, Congressman.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure having you
Great
here.
to see you, Tim.
Thank you very much.
Long friends. Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.